Hello students, this is Patrick O'Neill, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Meaning. This chapter is going to deal about the idea of deriving meaning, which is another way of saying understanding the message of the artist. What are they trying to say with the work? And how are they actually accomplishing this through the visual cues that are present in the artwork? In ways in which we can derive meaning, we have several different ways pointed out in the textbook that allow us to understand the message of the artwork. The textbook uses 5 different ways in which we can find meaning in artwork. First method is formal analysis. In formal analysis, just basically the study of the elements and the principles of art and how they are used in a specific artwork. Basically, it's sort of looking at the artwork at its own terms and seeing exactly, component by component, what the artist is using, composition, and also including symbolic imagery. One way we can look at it is the content of the artwork. This is sort of the messages that are embedded in it. It is the subject matter, but we also have other things such as symbolic references and also iconic reference. All artwork has subject matter. Even in abstract artwork or artwork that doesn't seem to have an actual, objective type of artwork, still has subject matter. Subject matter is basically the substance of that work of art. Even if the artist is just splattering random paint onto the canvas, the subject matter may not represent, say, a landscape or maybe a portrait, but maybe it's just the paint itself becomes the subject matter. Mark Rothko, an American painter from the mid-20th century, is an abstract painter, and his work were basically these large color-filled paintings. And they don't really represent, say, a landscape or any sort of a traditional piece of artwork. However, it still has a subject matter. This is basically the colors and the composition. And it's so elemental, that's really all there is to it. Another thing is sort of iconography that's sort of embedded within a piece of artwork. We have a visual metaphor, which is the image or an element that is descriptive of something else. We have symbols. These are images or elements that stand for or represent some other entity or concept. And finally, these symbols are culturally determined and they must be taught. Thinking back to last week, if you recall that graffiti painting on the side of a wall done by Banksy in Palestine, the idea of a dove is just not something that was chosen because it's just a bird. If you are familiar with biblical stories, a dove is sort of a symbol of peace. And so when a bird that represents peace has to wear a flak jacket while crosshairs are on it, it sort of becomes a symbol that the artist uses to talk about his message. But these symbols have to be taught. This is not innate, and it's just like a broken down shorthand to represent something else. Iconography can also apply to not just paintings and artwork, but also into architecture itself. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is designed to be a certain way. When the Founding Fathers were laying out the master plan for sort of what Washington, D.C. would be to come, they could have just made a bunch of very basic buildings without any ornamentation. But it's very interesting. The buildings themselves could have taken any form, but they were specifically chosen to represent images that refer to the classic Romans and the Greeks. And this is because America as a young republic didn't want to refer to, say, palaces and, castles that were sort of the kingdoms of Europe. They wanted to leave that behind, and so they would rather put themselves into a more idealistic mode. And so by making these buildings look like old Greek and Roman architecture, it's sort of referring itself back to the idealism of early democracies. One way we can understand artwork is by understanding not only the painting itself and its composition and sort of the iconography, but also the history of that artwork, its physical surroundings, and the method of encounter, which is all important to know the context in which the artwork was made. One of Rembrandt's most famous paintings is mostly known as the Night Watch. The Dutch were predominantly a secular culture, so most paintings were commissioned by merchants, the well-to-do middle class, group portraits of social clubs. This painting is not of, say, noblemen. These aren't people who own land. These aren't people who are powerful in the church, or nor are they kings, or nor are they nobles. These are people who are sort of the Night Watch, a sort of group of volunteers who were sort of protectors of the city, to sort of walk around and sort of protect it from any sort of harm. Early on, during the 80 Years' War, these were sort of very vital to keep the city safe. Near the tail end of it, it was less of a function of protection and more sort of a social club for men to get together and sort of play with their rifles. By now, Rembrandt's painting was kind of in the later half. It has a very interesting sort of approach. During this time, most groups, especially in the Netherlands, would be the people who would commission artists for these paintings. Most of them are pretty standard and kind of sort of straightforward. Rembrandt decided to take this subject matter a little bit more different and a little bit more dynamic. Most pictures and most paintings of this time would describe these types of group of people of just sort of standing, like they're posing for a painting. Rembrandt decided to do it a little bit different. He wanted to make dramatic lighting, give it a sense of mood and depth. And also, if you look around, there's also sense of actions. You have one gentleman who is loading a gun, another gentleman who is ready to fire their gun, and the other person, it looks like he is sort of kind of blowing out the soot, ready to reload it again. You have a drummer, and you sort of have a lot of movement, a lot of gesture. So there's a sort of a sense of action going on in this painting, which you typically didn't see at the time. His use of light, his sort of sense of creating the chiaroscuro effect is sort of a little bit different, a little bit more painterly, but again, very beautiful. The second thing we can talk about is physical surroundings. Paintings at this time became more and more secular, which is to say, not just things that would be hanging up inside of a church, describing biblical stories, and so you started to see more and more painters choosing and basically making a living painting other type of subjects, especially when you started to have the emerging class. Another thing is to understanding context is sometimes your experience is probably going to be different than someone else's experience. This is true for not only just in different time periods on this earth, but also in different cultures. Shirin Nesat's series, Women of Allah, is concerned with Islamic women and femininity, in a country where women's rights are limited by religious laws. And so she would make these photographs, make large output prints, and from there she would write calligraphy directly on top of the paper. And in that sort of Islamic tradition, she writes out scriptures based on sort of what it means to be a woman in Islam. Contrast that with sort of the more visceral and brutal images that seem to kind of create a contrast to sort of draw out her ideas. This is sort of a type of artwork that gives context to ideas that may be unfamiliar or foreign to us as Westerners. So it's very important to understand that context is important not only to sort of understanding a different time period, but also for understanding different people in different cultures around the globe. Another thing that we can find context is the physical surroundings for the artwork. The Trevi Fountain, like we mentioned before, is sort of the physical surroundings that give it meaning. The Trevi Fountain is a very beautiful and wonderful piece. But beyond its aesthetics, it also has a very strong historical context as well, and that is sort of given its physical location. And so location affects its meaning. It can also be events at a location can also change the meaning of an artwork. Olafur Eliasson is an artist who creates these large installation pieces. In this piece, titled New York City Waterfalls, the artist would sort of create these artificial waterfalls along the Hudson River, up and around Long Island, New York. This work is sort of talking about not only the source of that water, which is Niagara Falls further upstream, but also kind of brings that sort of understanding in a more visual way right up to the city. This type of artwork speaks directly to those who live in New York City. If this artwork was, say, placed in Austin or even in Dallas, it would be a little bit different, because our ideas of water use doesn't come from riverways, which can be hotly contested and very subject to environmental changes. Our own water usage tends to come from underwater aquifers. Changing its physical surroundings can change its meaning. Method of encounter also can change or add meaning. This is the Polta Palace. This is the summer palace of the Tibetan Buddhist leader from the Dalai Lama. What you're actually looking at, you're looking at a photograph. You're looking at a photograph that was taken by a photographer, edited, saved, put on a server, tagged with keywords, and then I eventually found it, and maybe I found some supplemental videos for it as well, where you guys are looking at it now. This is your method of encounter. It will look very different from standing at the foot of the palace versus just looking at a screen from the comfort of your room or your house or maybe in a coffee shop. This encounter changes your understanding and your meaning. Same could be said for the Mona Lisa. We've all seen the Mona Lisa. In fact, I don't even have to show you a picture of the Mona Lisa for me to put that image in your head. However, how many of us have actually stood in front of that Mona Lisa? Our encounters come from television, from cartoons, from posters, from books. So much so that maybe even the original artwork itself is no longer necessary. It's getting a little deep, but a little something to think about. Other things is understanding its context is also sort of understanding its function versus how it's presented. This drum is a Vietnamese drum, and like all drums, they're meant to be played. They're meant to be performed, and there's certain music and rituals that it's attached to. To actually truly understand this drum, you would have to listen to it being played by someone who knows how to play it in the tradition and in right context, either in the form of a festival or in its proper location in Vietnam. However, this drum is in Paris. It is also kind of devoid of accoutrements and design and extra flourishes that come with it. You can kind of see empty areas of where sashes, ropes may be attached to it. It is devoid of players. It is devoid of dancers. It is devoid of everything else that makes that drum that drum. So this is something we really need to take a look at. Museums are very important in presenting these ideas, presenting pieces of artwork from around the world and throughout history. But we also need to understand that by placing it in a museum, you may also be sort of stripping away a little bit of its cultural identity, reducing it down to sort of an object of aesthetic consideration rather than cultural consideration. And then it comes down also to understanding what is the best way for an object to be respected. Other ways we can understand artists and their artwork is we have writings about art. These writings about art can help us understand its full meaning. Who is it that actually write about art? Well, there are like several different people in several different sort of genres, and they talk about it in different ways. First, you have sort of the art critics. The art critics are sort of kind of the people who are employed by newspapers, or maybe they are people who are sort of in certain social circles that are known for their opinions about artwork, and they tend to sort of focus on new stuff. What is the new show? Did you see what that latest artist put in that famous gallery? Was it really good? Was it really bad? Well, these critics are kind of the people who sort of make sense of it. How does it sort of reflect their current work? How does it reflect their past work? And or how does this sort of fit in with sort of contemporary life? Art historians and academics tend to be a little bit more backward looking, which is to say that they are really interested in sort of the past, retrospective looks, and sort of maybe as you look back into the past, maybe there are new connections and sort of new ideas that can be sort of formed together. And this only emerges over time when you can see an artist's entire trajectory in sort of its complete form. Did the artist flame out early on in life or have a tragic ending? Or did they sort of peter on and sort of kept being persistent and kept creating art? These art historians also connect different art movements from one another. They may even sort of create what would be considered a canon, which is to say a body of work that is representative of an idea. Curators are people whose job it is to sort of put artwork together to be put on display. It is more than just simply hanging a bunch of paintings on a wall and making sure that the paintings are straight. Curators can sort of combine different sort of pieces of artwork from different times and can kind of come up with something new or maybe something fresh. Sometimes they can create something bold and daring, or something that's more scholarly, historic, and rather sort of conservative.
We can also read the writings and thoughts of the artists themselves, because who else better to explain their artwork and the thoughts behind it than by reading their thoughts on their own work in a contemporary sense where they just finished it, or maybe looking back at their career in the form of, say, a retrospective. That also can add some insight into understanding their artwork.
So once the artist creates that artwork, that understanding may change. The meaning of an artwork is not fixed, or is it ever permanent. Over time, different understandings, different interpretations can emerge. Writers can add new ideas and new interpretations to the same artwork, whether it is, a few years ago, or artwork that may be 500 or 1,000 years back. This is always sort of the case. One artist who's an example of where her intention may be a little bit different from the interpretation would be Georgia O'Keeffe. She's an artist from Santa Fe who is well known for creating these sort of abstract landscapes, still lifes of skulls, but most prominently she is known for her paintings of flowers. She gets these sort of very large, very up-close type of images of these flowers. They're very striking, they're very beautiful. They have soft colors, beautiful contours. There is also sort of a resemblance to female anatomy. There is sort of a vaginal quality to her artwork. This may not have been her intent, or at least she was always coy about whether or not that's what she intended her artwork to look like. But although she never said it, most curators, critics, and those who would write about artwork picked up on that connection immediately. So whether she did or didn't really intend is not really the point, because over time, the message of the artist's own interpretation may be different than the viewer's. So who are these critics? Who are these people who write about artwork? Why do they write about these artworks? And what kind of ideas emerged? Just like artwork has sort of different genres or different periods, there's also different types of people over time would have different ideas about artwork. Another fancy way of saying people having ideas about artwork is we would call it as criticisms. Criticisms is not the vernacular term of saying putting something down because here are the things I don't like it because this is my criticism, blah, 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 blah. Criticism is really a rigorous approach to understanding artwork. These are sort of philosophical positions, and they are sort of have these different ideas. With the emergence of sort of the new class of artwork, especially during the early 20th century, when artwork became more and more about being displayed in galleries and being pieces for people to buy, rather than to commission an artist to create something in the resemblance of somebody. Remember from like last chapter, we were talking about how artists were no longer sort of beholden to create reality. Well, now artists are sort of creating things that are creative and novel, and so they were very different. And so you sort of had to have these people who understood what the artist was trying to say and would sort of kind of categorize it so people can understand it. Some of the first of these critics would be sort of fit into what we call the modernist criticism. Modernist criticisms is a philosophical position. What they believed in sort of these things called master narratives. These master narratives really specify the correct way, and I'm air quotes, correct way of understanding and analyzing this artwork. Master narratives allow people to take an artwork, make sense of it by placing it in one of these master narratives, and these master narratives are sort of like a lens. It colors how they look at the artwork. These different sort of lenses is another way of saying philosophical position. A philosophical position is basically what's really important to you as a critic to understanding this artwork. There are many different types of philosophical positions. They're numerous, and not one is completely exclusive to the others. But these are sort of, at least pointed out in the textbook, the major ones that we're going to look at. You have the formalist criticism, the ideological criticism, we have the psychoanalytic criticism, and then we have structuralism. The first criticism we're going to go over is the formalist criticism. Their emphasis and what they were really into was just basically looking at the artwork. They thought that the artist was not as important as the artwork itself. The form of the artwork was the pure communicator. What we see on the canvas is what we are supposed to look at. And that is the best way to understand the artwork. And by formalist, they're talking about the forms, the composition, the color. This should be very familiar because when I asked you guys previously to do a formal analysis, which is to say take a look at a piece of artwork, tell me about its form, tell me about its composition. Well, that's basically a formalist criticism. In this example, Maurice Louis has this painting called The Blue Veil. This artist would make these very large canvas paintings, but he would do it very differently. He would take a canvas and we would stretch it out on a stretcher, which is kind of a wooden frame. But instead of, remember how we talked about how artists would sort of prepare that surface with, say, a gesso or maybe glazes. The artist would use raw canvas, which is to say it was very porous, and paint could seep through it, right? And so he would actually lay it on the floor, face up, and they would put paint and would sort of tilt it and pour it onto the canvas. The porous canvas would sort of let that paint drip through and let it sort of kind of play as it would slide down as gravity would pull it across the canvas. And so if you're looking at a formalist criticism of this type of artwork, we can look at what some of the original writers were saying about the blue veil. Critic Clement Greenberg loved this work. You don't have to know his name, I just, it's mentioned. He is a critic, right? And he's one of these, people who are sort of a formalist, right? In the textbook, it doesn't really show you a really good picture of it. You don't get a good understanding. It just looks like some kind of crafts project you would make, in kindergarten, right? This blue veil was very interesting because it was considered a pure painting. It eliminated all brushstrokes. It emphasized the flatness of the painting surface. And basically, it's artwork that sort of exists without the artist himself actually impressing it by sort of using brushstrokes, right? It's kind of fancy, right? But let's actually look at the piece before we can kind of jump to any conclusions. So look at it. It's kind of big, right? And it's kind of wild looking. It does kind of look like a spill or something, like maybe, a bunch of paints, in a sink or something. But you get up real close to it, and that's that raw canvas, right? You see these small channelings, and you kind of see different colors begin to overlap other colors. And remember we were talking about paints and how you mix them to create all these other different colors? Well, that's kind of what's going on here. The artist is still mixing paints, still mixing basic colors to get other colors and different tints and different shades. And this is not the only thing that the artist has done. The artist has other works that are very similar. To the left is another one of his sort of examples. So looking at the piece, it's kind of interesting, right? You have nothing to contemplate other than the paint itself. You're not looking at, contemplating maybe a flower, or contemplating maybe, an angel, or some sort of figure that you have Duke or whatever from some unknown place you really don't know. You're just looking at the paint on the canvas. The form, right? The form is what's important. Now we have other different types of criticisms that's beyond just what we see. You also have ones that are sort of trying to understand the undercurrents that led to that artwork. You have ideological criticism. A lot of this was sort of rooted in the readings of Karl Marx, who can kind of deal with a lot of different ideas about politics. Now, Karl Marx may be famous for writing the Communist Manifesto, but he was also very famous for coming up with ideas to critically think about economies, nation states, and how workers are sort of affected by the politics of the nation that they live in. This can be anything from basic worker rights, but as far as what we're concerned with is we're also looking at sort of how artists are affected by the politics in which their artwork was made. If you were sort of if you were a critic who is interested in ideological criticism, they would sort of posit that all artwork, any kind of artwork, may seem neutral, still can contain a political statement. Meaning, artwork basically says a lot about the politics in which you create your artwork. What you can say, what you can't say, or how you speak about the community, how you speak about your government. It may be sort of inferred, it may be explicit, or may be completely oblivious to the artist. But for someone who's interested in ideological criticism, they're really interested in sort of the politics at play to kind of what led you to that art, what led the artist to create that artwork. They're very interested in sort of understanding the underpinnings. Juan O'Gorman is a muralist. And in the tradition of Mexican art, murals play a very strong component, not only in just sort of visual art, but where it's displayed and what it means to sort of display it. Is an image about Mexico's independence. Within it, you have the artist is including everybody. You have everybody from religious leaders, indigenous cultures, you have clergy, you have warriors, you have the middle class, you have kingdoms, you have even religious images in the back, often to the side. They tell a story for its citizens. And we can understand it also by understanding what kind of artwork it is. This is a mural. A mural is a painting on the side of a wall. It's not a canvas to sort of hang up in some kind of stuffy state hall. It's something to be on display for everybody. And one thing that's really important for political artwork is that it has to be seen by everybody. What art is shown in a public area is incredibly important for the identity of that people. What does it say about the government? What kind of values is it trying to tell its citizens what's important and what is not important? So when you look at artwork with an ideological criticism, you're really just sort of understanding, taking a look at a piece of artwork, and we're not looking at its form, but we're kind of understanding what politics are at play that led to this piece of artwork from being made. Another type of understanding of artwork is what we call the psychoanalytic criticism. Psychoanalytic criticism looks at art as a product of the individuals shaped by their pasts, by their unconscious urges, and also by their social histories. A lot of this sort of emerged with sort of Sigmund Freud in his sort of psychoanalytic process. Basically, we are all sort of these creatures that are sort of lost in ourselves, and we sort of act out these urges that we may not be fully conscious of. The subconscious is really what drives us, and not our sort of conscious being. And so, people who are interested in the psychoanalytic criticism of artwork are really interested in sort of the underpinnings of what this artist is gone through and how it gets them to create that artwork. This psychoanalytic criticism is appropriate for work that deals with very strong emotional content. It could be talking more about intuitions rather than realities. Dreams, imagery, symbolism, or maybe even fantastic elements. In this painting by Kay Sage, Tomorrow is Never, you have sort of a surrealist painting. Remember surrealists, right? When we talked about them earlier, it was a movement of artwork where the artists were all interested in tapping and unlocking sort of that subconscious mind. So the psychoanalytic criticism kind of goes hand in hand with the surrealists. And with Kay Sage, here is her painting, Tomorrow is Never. Even the title itself is sort of suggested to maybe a lost future that will never come to be. If we look at the painting itself, it has the qualities of surrealism. It is recognizable only by the shapes themselves, but it doesn't seem to represent reality. We have these sort of scaffolding that is sort of wrapped around these sort of poles, or maybe even statue-type figures, kind of emerging from clouds, or maybe smog, or is that fog? We're not quite exactly sure, but we can feel that the air is heavy, because as items are being sort of pushed back into the distance, remember the sort of compositional element of atmospheric perspective. Further away objects are foggier, less saturated. It seems to give a sense of sort of a heavy mood. The clouds seem to be holding back any sort of real sunlight, and it kind of feels very sort of drab, and it almost feels a sense of hopelessness in this type of painting. Now that's sort of the formal analysis, right? I'm talking about the psychoanalytic. So what is a psychoanalytic analysis would be? Well, they would start by sort of understanding who Kay Sage is, or was. At this time in the 1950s, her husband that she'd been married to, another artist, was going through cancer. At this time, there was a stigma attached to a person who was sort of suffering with cancer because treatments weren't exactly well known, and understanding it and understanding his origin was really baffling. And so you can kind of see what she was kind of talking about. Her sort of sense of what could be a life with her husband further down the line is kind of denied to her. And she's expressing that sort of trauma. Again, critics are allowed to sort of interpret these things at any point in time. And so psychoanalytic criticism can be applied to this painting 10 years later. Because at 10 years after she made this painting, she herself succumbed to depression and committed suicide. So that kind of changes the context. To show how grief-stricken she was, not only is this sort of an expression of her pain, but maybe it also gave a greater insight into sort of the helplessness of what she felt, and maybe understanding what was lost by her husband's death. Ooh, that was a little morbid. And so these modernists would kind of make these kind of boxes. So anything that would sort of fit into their interests would be placed in that sort of box, if you will. Structuralism is sort of an idea of looking at the artwork by understanding its sort of structure. So an artwork itself doesn't exist as a single piece. It's part of a structure of other artworks. So looking in close, you see one painting, but as you zoom out, a full, complete image emerges. Right? It's just merely one link that's interlinked with other links. Structuralism is a very modernist position. Structuralism is a modernist position, meaning that they were all about, again, finding one correct interpretation to come at a capital T truth behind the artwork. Something funny kind of happened when it was sort of the idea of modernism was sort of applied to its final and maximum thought, which is the structuralism. That is, it doesn't really work. And so, with the emergence of structuralism, these cracks started to sort of form around the edges. Are you really trying to understand artwork? Are you just trying to place art and understanding its artwork into already predefined little boxes that makes it easier to sort of correlate from one another, but not really deeply understand that artwork on its own terms? And so you sort of had the emergence of something that we would call postmodernism. Postmodernism is also sometimes called post-structuralism, especially when it comes to sort of aesthetic philosophies, which is, the philosophy of looking at understanding art. Postmodernism was sort of very different from modernists. Instead of having those master narratives, where everything can either fit in one box or two boxes, we were more concerned with little narratives. Each of its own artwork should be probably be appreciated by itself, rather than sort of within a structure. It is also, artwork is a bricolage, which is basically a creation that is made from not one idea and everything radiates from it, but rather it is a diverse stories and images. In order for art to really have its life, is to sort of embrace that diversity. It is also a celebration of differences. Rather than finding likeness between one artwork and the other, postmodernists were really interested in finding out the differences between two pieces of artwork, or two different artists, or two different philosophies. It was also, postmodernist was very happy with plurality. Plurality is a way of saying it can be many things to many different people, rather than sort of, again, trying to adhere to one or two philosophies that it sort of kind of maybe fit into. Because what would happen is that most artwork doesn't really fit that way. And so a lot of artwork would just be tossed to the side and ignored, because artists would create work that only, critics would be interested in, and critics were only interested in one or two master narratives, which leads to sort of insular cycle of sameness. Postmodernists were very interested in stuff that kind of was outside that mainstream. They would embrace the ideas of paradoxes, which is artwork that isn't supposed to make sense, that isn't supposed to be fully understood. So modernists were really interested in certainties, things that are knowable as if it is objective. Postmodernism is different. It is sort of deals itself in subjectivity, which is to say, everybody seems to have things a little bit different. Different opinions, or sort of different approaches. It was more about nuances, the small things, rather than the big things. And again, it embraced ambiguity. Rather than knowing everything about a piece of artwork and being authoritative about it, maybe we really shouldn't. Maybe we should be a little bit ambiguous about what art really means, because my interpretation of this artwork and why I like it shouldn't be a reason why you should like it. Nor should you feel pressured to. And so this post-structuralism would be sort of a range of reactions. It was really a reaction against modernists, and it was also a reaction against, again, those modernists creating those structures of understanding. Because those structures of understanding would only self-reinforce things such as misconceptions, ideas that would be considered contradictions or myths or even stereotypes. Post-structuralism was sort of kind of wanting to pry that open and to really sort of make sense of it, to sort of combat those type of ideas. Jacques Derrida was sort of a theorist and sort of a philosopher who sort of applied this idea of deconstruction to everything, not just artwork. He was mostly known for sort of understanding deconstructionism in the context of societies. But for us, we're kind of interested in the aesthetics. Deconstruction, again, holds that from the inside, any system can look natural and coherent. Take, for example, psychoanalytic. Their approach may seem scientific and could be final, but really, it could be filled with unseen contradictions, myths, and stereotypes about subject matter, about history, and about the type of people who make the artwork. One of the first sort of criticisms to emerge from postmodernism is the feminist criticism. It is sort of concerned with the oppression of groups, especially women, in society at large. Feminism advocates for equal social, political, and economic rights for all women and men. Not only does a patriarchy sort of suppress women into acting and behaving a certain way, it also sort of suppresses men into acting and behaving in a certain way as well. These behaviors and attitudes can be seen in artwork. And so a feminist criticism of art is not really so much the artwork itself, but sort of understanding what modes of oppression are at work and how can we sort of dismantle that. And feminists would go on to break down barriers that are encountered by women artwork and in the media that they use. Modernist critics would degenerate pottery, weaving, and decorative works as sort of a minor art, unworthy of sort of the same way that paintings are elevated above it. This is sort of a stereotype. This is sort of old ideas reinforcing itself. So a postmodernist inquiry from a feminist point would look at artwork such as this Navajo weaving blanket, woven by a woman, to be studied and featured in museums, and not just sort of a thing to be sort of ignored. Feminist critics and art historians would also go back in time. Remember that understanding artwork is not rigid, it constantly changes with the society in which it exists. And so historians would research previous paintings and would find several interesting observations. For example, 17th century Italian artist ARTS1301 was a well-known painter at the time. Her father was also a well-known painter, and she studied under her father's craft. She would make these very large, huge historical paintings, not uncommon like other artists in her time were commissioned for making. When she was alive, she was well known and well regarded for being a wonderful master of painting and light. After she died, however, most of her work was misattributed to her father, and her own personal life sort of faded away. This is due to critics at the time choosing to sort of either de-emphasize her, but if you look at her paintings, they're really quite interesting. In and of itself, you can kind of see this painting as it through the eyes of a woman rather than a man. What can we bring to this sort of depiction that would say be different than you would get from a male painter? Let's look at this example. In this painting of Judith and Holofernes depicts the decapitation of this general. What is really interesting is what we actually see. If we take a formal approach, let's see what we have. We have Judith and her servant sort of kind of pushing this man down. Her arms gripping the side of his head, her hand strong and gripping a blade and basically severing his head. What really strikes out to me is sort of how helpless the man looks by these two women and how gruesome his sort of end is. Compared to sort of another sort of depiction by Caravaggio, a contemporary of her. Notice how sort of the servant isn't even barely involved. Is sort of kind of almost standing away, almost sort of disgusted at what's happening. The man doesn't look so much like he's being overpowered, but maybe he's caught off guard. He's not really being dominated, he's merely being sort of surprised. And notice her hands are sort of more feminine. They don't seem to have any sort of muscle, and it doesn't really seem like she's really into this sort of thing. She looks more disgusted and scared and worried, especially looking at his sort of furrowed eyebrows. Again, look at Artismes. Look at her depiction of the same thing. It's really quite striking, and at first it may be a little subtle, but once you notice it, you just can't help but thinking, which is really the more powerful representation of this sort of biblical story. As we move further and further into the 20th century, with sort of the ideas of postmodernism still sort of ringing in critics' minds, we have the idea of what's called visual culture, which is to say that culture is no longer being sort of topped down. The sort of modernist way of thinking about artwork is that the artists would create the vision, and from there would affect society. Postmodernism, again, of course, since they're all about sort of decentralizing power and making away with sort of assumptions of how things used to be, embrace sort of new technologies that sort of changed the social landscape that we saw in the 20th century. Namely, mass media, through the images presented in magazines, newsreels, the movies, radio, television, and later on to the internet, where you have a mishmash of not only previous things, but new things such as memes, mashups, and remakes. Understanding this sort of pop culture media rather than just sort of a sideshow to culture at large, postmodernism is also interested in the idea of visual culture. Visual culture is sort of an attempt to integrate all of the visual components of contemporary life in understanding aesthetics through this kind of lens. People that live in industrialized nations consume massive numbers of images on a day-to-day basis. A person living in this decade will consume more images in a single day than, say, someone 50 years ago would see in over a decade. How does that affect us? What does that mean? How do they get formed? Or maybe this cascade of images only makes them numb, because every 5 seconds there's a new image to consume, and we kind of get lost in that noise. Visual culture is really interested in other ideas, and they are opening the scope to not just paintings and architecture, which is sort of more traditional, and are more open up to sort of applying those same criticisms to artwork, but they apply it to other things, such as film, advertisement, the internet, television, video games. They apply that same critical eye that they applied to art to understand culture. One thing that sort of emerges from postmodernism is sort of different ways of thinking about artwork. And one of the most helpful, and I think the most sort of wonderful and liberating and democratizing idea is the idea of phenomenology. A very fancy word, very long word. I'm not going to expect you to know how to say it, but you're supposed to understand what it means. It basically holds that your engagement with an artwork, it produces an intellectual and emotional response based on your own ideas that come from your own personal tastes, your own experiences, and your own history with the world and the culture at large. This is what we call a personal interpretation, meaning your own understanding of the artwork based on your own terms, rather than that of, say, the opinions of some critic who's, a modernist, who thinks there's only maybe one or two ways to understand a piece of artwork. Personal interpretation kind of rebukes that idea. While looking at this painting by Andrew Wyeth, painting called Christina's World, the artist is using egg tempera on gessoed panel. Now, this is a painting that was done in the 1940s. So why was he using egg tempera on gesso panel, which was a method that was used back in the 15th century? Well, it's in the 1940s. We're in the age of where an artist can choose whatever it is they want to use. It has meaning. So what is the artist trying to say? If we look at this painting, and we just kind of look at the compositional elements, we have a woman who's sort of kind of on the floor in what looks to be sort of a grassland. She has sort of a faded pink dress. If we look up close, she has shoes that are torn and tattered. Her hands are sort of gnarled and dirty, covered in dirt. And not only that, covered in scrapes, and her knuckles are swollen. Her dress itself is also covered in dirt of the land, and it seems to be almost sun-bleached. Her hair is sort of kind of in a disarray. Her posture seems to be a reaching out forward, looking out into the landscape. You don't see her face, but you know where she's looking. You can still get a sense of sort of where she needs to be or where she wants to be going, just by getting a sense of her posture. And also, look at her location. It seems to be sort of a flat land. And then we see off into the distance an old farmhouse. So if this was the 1940s, these are the type of buildings that were probably left behind during the Great Depression. The whitewashing has faded. There are shingles missing on the roof. A barn looks like it's just one breeze away from collapsing in on itself. What is our interpretation of this scene? Without really knowing so much, does it give us a sense of hope? Does it give it a sense of struggle? Does it fill you with sort of a sense of dread? Is it something familiar? Or is it something that's completely unfamiliar? All the things that you're feeling when you look at this artwork is your own history, your own life being applied into that artwork. Because that is the only way you can understand anything, is by using whatever it is that you have in your past almost instantly applied to this piece of artwork. This is called Christina's World because this is a painting of Andrew Wyeth lived in the city, but his parents still lived on a farm out in Maine. And he would visit them from time to time. And one of their neighbors was this girl, Christina. She was paralyzed from the waist below. And so the only way she could move about her farm was to crawl with her body kind of dragging behind it to get around. This is in the days when access and also wheelchair technology just wasn't really quite there to be able to deal with this kind of landscape. And so now it's sort of kind of very interesting to look at it again. You can kind of see her life from a lower point of view. Notice that horizon line's really high up, as if you as well are looking up at a far, far away building, which probably, if you're standing up, wouldn't be that much of a walk. And her body, again, seems to be fragile. Look at her arm and how it's sort of straining to keep herself upright. It's a really amazing and a beautiful painting. So, again, expanding again on phenomenology, let's take a look at this painting. Gustave Cabaret. And this is sort of a painting that is sort of, it has a mood. I don't even have to say it, right? Look at the figures. You don't see their faces. One gentleman is cut off on the far left side. All the colors are a pale blue. The steel is blue. The jacket is blue. The pants are drab. Everybody seems to be devoid of color. You can feel sort of the cold on it. We don't really have to be explicitly told these things. If you've ever been in a cold or bitter situation, you probably would feel the same way. They're wearing jackets. You wear jackets when it's cold. The sky sort of almost loses its sort of brightness, and it kind of feels dull and dead. And we can kind of see that also in the shadows, because there is a lack of them. And interesting, if we look at another painting by the same artist of the same subject matter, exact same bridge, different point of view, but look, it seems to have a different feel. There's now a perspective, right? Now we have one point perspective, right? We can kind of see it's actually focused on the men and the woman that are walking, the lady with the parasol. But also the colors are brighter. The sun is brighter. The shadows are out. It doesn't feel so cold. It doesn't feel so isolated. It's kind of interesting how that can happen. Another really interesting example, especially that is beginning to emerge right now, is sort of how we as a society, or just us, we live a different way than people maybe in the 1860s. Well, we still see artwork from a 21st century point of view. And in this painting, the expected one, it kind of takes on a different type of interpretation just because societal norms have completely changed. If you look at the lady, what we have here is a woman who's sort of walking along this road. She's clutching something and looking down. And to her right is sort of a rocky road. To the left, you have some sort of, gentleman who is ready to propose to her. And this is sort of kind of like one of those idyllic paintings from this time period, which were always about sort of presenting a vulnerable woman in a moral conundrum. This serves sort of a purpose of telling her to beware of the perils of the world outside. If you look a little closer, it may be a little something different. She's clutching something, and it seems to be glowing. What could this possibly be? Well, Anybody who's from the 21st century will initially sort of notice the resemblance of a woman holding a small pocket Bible that is slowly glowing to that of a woman holding a smartphone from the 21st century. And it's kind of funny because it's almost kind of saying the same thing. In artwork past, there was always sort of criticism of the woman being so infatuated and being sort of oblivious to the dangers around her. Again, she needs to be so careful because if she strays from her path, which is almost a metaphor, she either falls into darkness. She will literally fall into a pit that is covered in shadow and in darkness. And if she strays too much to the other side, well, she may have some sort of amorous affair, and that will pull her also away from her path. Whereas today, women are constantly criticized for looking at their phones, for being self-absorbed by taking selfies, and for being on social networks. Not unlike the criticisms in the past. One thing I do want to touch on is the ideas of sort of conceptual artwork, because this is sort of becomes a thing because criticism exists. Because who is it that was looking at artwork now? By the beginning of the 20th century, artwork was really made for the consumption of galleries and for those who patronized it. And those who patronized it were, critics and art collectors and people who just were sort of really enthusiastic about artwork. And so when you want to make artwork that talks about it, well, it has to have an idea. There is an emergence of the idea. And so this brings us to sort of one of the most controversial pieces of artwork. Not because of what it was, but because of what did it really mean. And it's an idea that we're still grappling with over 100 years since. Marcel Duchamp was an artist who was more of a conceptual artist. He was sort of the first type of artist who is playing with people's perceptions of what is to be expected and sort of blowing that out of the water. And so in 1917, he made an artwork that was called The Fountain, in which he sort of took a urinal, placed it on its side, and with a bit of paint, signed it R. Mutt, 1917. This piece itself was then placed on a pedestal in an art show. People were absolutely dumbfounded by this piece of artwork. Hanging around them were paintings of landscapes, genre paintings, portraits, lots of beautiful artwork. And here's this thing that this artist had the audacity to place a urinal and call it art. Well, that's sort of what the artist Marcel Duchamp was trying to get at. Why is something considered art? Is it art simply because the artist chose? And once the artist chooses something, does it become art? If an artist chooses to make a painting of a landscape, the artist chose that, and then it becomes art. So whether Mr. Mutt was with his own hands made the fountain or not doesn't really matter. He chose the artwork. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance, that is, a urinal, is no longer a urinal. It disappears. It disappears under the new title and a new point of view that is created for a new idea. And when an artist creates a new idea in someone else's head, well, heck, that is the very essence of art. And so Duchamp would go on and make these very strange sort of sculptures. He would use the ready-made and would then transform them into new things. There are three ideas behind this ready-made process. The creative part of the artwork of a ready-made is basically the choice itself. When an artist makes a choice, that is the creative act, not the painting, not the making, not the melding, not the sculpting, but the actual choice itself is the artwork. It's the creativity bit. And then you take that object, you cancel its useful function. then it becomes art. That urinal, now tipped on its side, is no longer a urinal. Therefore, it becomes art, because it's no longer useful. And then you present that object. Once you present that object by adding a title, you give it a new thought, therefore you give it a new meaning. It's a bit out there, and it still is pretty much out there. A lot of artwork, especially contemporary artwork, is criticized for its relying too heavily on this sort of process of the choice and the creative act. Even today, the concept of the artist creating a work not really by merit or by virtuosity of their ability to paint or draw, but rather their ability to be merely creative in coming up with an idea, is still very controversial. In 2019, at Art Basel, which is a big art show in Miami, an artist sold an artwork for $120,000. That's not really uncommon because Art Basel is sort of a big gathering of where the big hitters in the art world, or in the contemporary commercial art world, go to sort of sell their paintings. A lot of paintings actually go for more than this. What was outrageous wasn't the price, but it was the artwork itself. And in fact, the artwork itself was the description of the artwork. It wasn't the art. So the object itself was a description of how to prepare a piece of artwork, and that is to duct tape a banana to a wall. That was the artwork. And of course, people were exclaiming that this is sort of an emperor's has no clothes moment, where basically this is just foolishness, this is a joke, it's kind of making fun of art in the art world. And to a point, I guess they're kind of right. I mean, it's kind of absurd, right? Because that banana goes bad in a few days. So they're going to always have to put a new banana up. And so the artwork isn't actually a banana, and it isn't the actual piece of duct tape. It is the instructions of how to construct it. But the thing is, anybody can do that, except for art galleries. The only one art gallery is allowed at a time to hang this up, only given at the permission by the person who bought the artwork. It cannot exist concurrently anywhere else in the world, and you can only display it at one place at one given time. So, what is the artist really trying to say with this piece? But what we're really having is, what are some other things that people pay on that really is just an idea? Well, sure, a banana taped to a wall is absurd, but people pay money for it. That's even very absurd. But you know, people also pay billions of dollars for applications. And they're not really paying for the applications. They're paying for the idea of that application, or maybe the people who can use it. So it seems like it's sort of making a commentary on contemporary capitalism. Or maybe on copyright law. Anybody can draw a mouse, but if you draw a mouse with certain circular features that look like a certain sort of mouse that was drawn in the 1930s by a certain man who lived in Hollywood, you would have copyright lawyers going after you. Why? Because although anybody can draw Mickey Mouse, only one corporation is actually allowed to sell and license depictions of Mickey Mouse. How is that any less absurd than paying for the idea of taping a banana to a wall? One last thing. As we go through this sort of new technology and these new worlds, as we go into the 21st century, where cameras and technology seems to be less and less about taking photographs for images, but for quantitizing the world around us. Cameras no longer serve people for their aesthetic enjoyment, but for sort of at the service of robots. For example, this is a Tesla Model 3 that has sort of the autopilot feature And what this car has, at several different positions all around it, it has cameras. And so it can get, a 365-degree view. Both sensors and radar, above, behind, around. And it makes sense of the world around it. Identifying objects, identifying people, identifying cars, understanding traffic, understanding lanes. And so these cameras are not in the service of people, but in the service of machines. What does that look like? Going further still, this isn't the first time we've thought about making things that aren't meant for human eyes. Back in the 1970s, when NASA was going to launch their Voyager 1 and the Voyager 2 in the deepest parts of space, which it still is going, and still is going on now since, for over 50 years, what happens if another culture of beings find it? Should we put anything on it? What would it say? I mean, how can we even begin to explain the ideas of a word? Letters, these are all, again, symbols and concepts that have to be taught, and how can you teach them if you're not there to show them? And so Carl Sagan and a few other artists would sort of create these sort of golden records that are kind of placed inside of it, with the intent of basically not being for human consumption, but as a way to describe the origin of the spacecraft to anyone who may have bumped up against it. So you're creating artwork, or just you're creating something that's not even for this world. And that brings us to this week's question and this week's prompt. For this week, I'm going to give you a link. It'll be available in the chapter page on the link to Chapter 4 found on Blackboard. And I want you to take a look at this painting. I'm not going to tell you anything about it now. You're going to have to discover it yourself. But I want you to look at it, and I want you to sort of think about it. Find out who did it. Could you describe that and find out what artwork it is? And then, of course, what's the formal qualities of it? Again, what is it made out of? What does it look like? What compositional elements were used? We're building, right? We're building on those previous examples, those previous exercises that we've done. And from there, I want you to do your own phenomenological response. But I want you to go more than just sort of saying, this makes me feel happy because I like the colors, or I like this because it reminds me of something. I want you to dig a little deeper. What is it in the past? What are your past experiences that led to your response? Do you react that way because it reminds you of your childhood? Does it remind you of someone you know? Or maybe a part in your life that made you feel happy? Or maybe made you feel sad? Made you feel lonesome? A full range of emotions in different sort of situations. Dig a little deeper than just saying that simple reaction. Get to the root of it. Thank you all for coming by this week. Again, I appreciate your time and your attention, and I wish you good health and stay safe out there. I'll see you next week. Have a good day.